Saw dudes, Sevagoth Prime released, and he's stupid fun to play and is an effective Warframe. The Dark Helmsman is an adept commander of the battlefield and one of the easiest frames to nuke with, even at level cap. Also, his Shadow is a super fun addition to his kit, and while it can be unwieldy and the ultimate forma dump, it leaves him with many gameplay options. Sevagoth Prime is an amazing Warframe worth your time and investment. This video covers the best build variants for Sevagoth Prime, including his Shadow and Claws. If you're ready to rain hell from your railjack, let's get started. As usual, we're going to start with an overview of Sevagoth Prime's abilities. If you do know how the frame works, please use the timestamps to skip to the build sections. Sevagoth's passive is his Shadow, which he can command through various means. Sevagoth's Shadow has its own set of abilities and an exalted melee weapon. Since it's such an integral part of his kit, we're going to cover it first. The Shadow itself acts as another Warframe and can be modded like one, including Aura mods, Exilus mods, and Arcanes. Upon entering Bleed Out, Sevagoth's body petrifies and becomes a tombstone, and his Shadow gets manifested. To self-revive, the Shadow needs to collect 5 enemy souls by Consume via the ability Quick Melee or Fire Weapon buttons with a targeted enemy on the aiming reticle. Upon collecting 5 souls, Sevagoth revives. Consume in the Bleed Out state costs 0 energy and inflicts armor and shield bypassing damage equal to the target's total hit points to instantly kill non-boss enemies. His Shadow also comes with the exalted melee weapon Shadow Claws. These claws deal high damage and are locked to Sevagoth's Shadow, meaning he himself cannot use them. They do not benefit from, nor contribute to the set bonus of any set mods, except for the sacrificial set. Ability strength increases the damage of the claws, but is affected by Sevagoth's ability strength stat, not the Shadow's. Then there's the Death Well. Killing enemies affected by Sevagoth's or his Shadow's abilities will fill the Death Well, as seen on the bottom right of the HUD. When the Death Well reaches 75% or higher, you can activate Exalted Shadow to control it directly. Shadow's first ability is Embrace, where it expends 25 energy to tether and pull enemies within a conical area of 20 meters. The enemies hit by this ability are lifted for 8 seconds and are pulled towards the cast location. This ability does not require line of sight to pull enemies. Consume is Shadow's second ability, where it expends 25 energy to lunge forward 14 meters. If an enemy is targeted by the ability, it inflicts 2500 radiation damage and knocks them down. It will also heal Shadow's health pool by 25% of the total damage dealt. The target's soul is ejected up and the body suffers from confusion status. Death's Harvest causes the Shadow to expend 75 energy to inflict a death mark on all enemies within a 12-meter radius. The marked enemies receive a 50% damage vulnerability debuff for 10 seconds. This ability does not need line of sight to hit targets. Shadow's final ability is Reunite. Casting the ability costs no energy and teleports Sevagoth over an unrestricted range to the Shadow's location to merge. This ability is casted automatically if the Death Well runs empty, if Shadow is killed, or if Sevagoth enters a nullifier bubble. For each percent of the Death Well drained during the usage of Exalted Shadow, Sevagoth's health is healed by 1% of his maximum health pool once Reunite is complete. Now we can cover Sevagoth's abilities. First we have Reap. Casting costs 25 energy and sends Sevagoth's Shadow in the direction of the reticle. The Shadow lasts for 6 seconds with a variable flight speed of 10 meters per second if tapping the ability, or 20 meters per second if held down. The Shadow's Wail weakens all enemies in 8 meters, inflicting 250 radiation damage and marking them with Death's Harvest. Those affected by Death's Harvest get a 50% damage vulnerability debuff for 10 seconds. Only one Shadow from Reap can be active at a time. Reap can be directed by aiming down sights while active. So is Sevagoth's second ability. Sevagoth expends 50 energy to implant Death Seeds into all enemies in a radius of 16 meters. Enemies hit suffer 250 true damage per second over 10 seconds. This ability does not require line of sight to inflict damage. Zone enemies that are hit by Reap, Sevagoth's first ability, are dealt 25% of their current health as true damage and detonate, dealing 25% of their current health as blast damage to all enemies in a 4-meter radius. The detonation damage has no falloff, making Reap and So Sevagoth's main nuking abilities. Gloom is his third ability. On cast, Sevagoth expends 50 energy and unleashes a pulse of radial darkness that has an initial radius of 4 meters, which then expands to 16. Enemies in the aura suffer from a 35% slow, while allies and Sevagoth gain a 5% lifesteal buff. Enemies do not need to be in line of sight to be slowed. Each enemy in the radius of Gloom drains 0.75 energy per second, up to a cap of 10 enemies for a 7.5 energy drain. And finally, we have Sevagoth's final ability, which comes full circle, Exalted Shadow. Once 75% of the Death Well is filled, Sevagoth can take direct control of his Shadow. The Shadow drains 1% of the Death Well per second while active. It does not have access to equipped weapons other than its exalted weapon, Shadow Claws. Sevagoth's game loop is fairly simple despite the numerous abilities he possesses. At the start of the mission, activate Gloom to have a constant CC aura and lifesteal. Then use So on enemies to plant Death Seeds and Reap to detonate them and get easy nuke kills. Repeat until the Death Well is filled, then cast Exalted Shadow. Use Shadow's Claws and abilities to get easy kills, then switch back to Sevagoth. Rinse and repeat. This video features 2 main Sevagoth builds and 2 main Shadow builds alongside a Claw build. As usual, please use the timestamps to navigate the video. We will begin with the non-Helminth Sevagoth build, which utilizes Sevagoth's nuking potential and Shadow to kill enemies. For all builds, the aura will be Brief Respite since Sevagoth relies on shield gating to stay alive in high-level activities. This mod refunds 150% of energy spent back to shields, which allows us to top up our shield gate time. The Exilus mod can be Prime Sure-Footed if you'd like, but personally, I like running Power Drift. The extra 15% ability strength makes it easier to nuke enemies with the Reap and So combo. Catalyzing Shields works with Brief Respite to fully recharge shields after 1 cast of So or 2 casts of Reap. It also sets our shield gate duration to 1.33 seconds, which is enough time to find cover or perform evasive maneuvers. Prime Continuity extends the debuff duration from Reap and reduces the energy drain per enemy from Gloom. Since both abilities are integral to our kit, it's best to have some form of ability duration. Equilibrium and Prime Flow pad out our energy economy and provide enough energy regen and stores to keep the game loop smooth. Equilibrium will have to be used with Synth Deconstruct, so mod your companion accordingly. Transient Fortitude ups our ability strength, putting us closer to the 200% strength cap we need to hit in order to one-shot enemies with Reap and So. Keep in mind that enemies need to have at least 1 viral proc on them with 200% strength to get killed by the combo. Stretch increases the range of Gloom and the range of Reap and So. Now let's talk about the good stuff, the augment mods. Shadow Haze causes Death's Harvest to grant our weapons a flat crit chance buff. Enemies affected by Reap or Death's Harvest spawn a new Reap Shadow on death up to a max of 3. Since Reap applies Death's Harvest to enemies, this means we have a constant crit chance steroid, drastically increasing our outgoing weapon damage. The crit chance from this mod is applied in a similar way to Arcane Avenger and Covenant, essentially granting a flat crit chance bonus. With our current ability strength, we get a 85% crit chance buff, granting almost every weapon we use guaranteed crits on top of their innate crit chance. This buff only gets stronger with our Arcanes later on. Finally, we have Dark Propagation, which is an augment for So. Enemies that are killed while affected by So spread its effect in a 15-meter radius, and Shadow's Death Harvest also inflicts So. This essentially turns Sevagoth into a nuke machine, and allows its Reap and So combo to reapply itself within crowds. Enemies that die will continue the chain reaction and allow for easier kills. Next, we have the Helminth variant of the build, with Roar put in place over Exalted Shadow. Naturally, this means Shadow will be locked behind the Revive passive and can't be used in normal combat. This build can go into Endurance content fairly easily if you so choose. The only change to this build is a swap from Transient Fortitude to Umbral Intensify. The reason for this switch is to preserve as much ability duration as possible, since Roar is a buff that needs constant reapplication. The extra duration afforded to us by Umbral Intensify will reduce our overall energy expenditure over time. Even with the loss of 11% ability strength, we can still make it up through Archon shards and Arcanes. With this build, you need at least 255% ability strength with both Reap and Roar active on an enemy to allow the next So and Reap combo to one-shot an enemy without needing viral status. This is easily achieved with Archon shards down the line, so don't sweat it too much here. If you want the maximum amount of safety for level cap runs, I suggest swapping out Umbral Intensify or Transient Fortitude for Rolling Guard. 3 seconds of invulnerability provided by Rolling Guard is immensely helpful in stressful situations and makes survival a lot easier. Also, it makes status cleanse possible and makes Sevagoth a much safer frame to play as a whole. Even though Gloom can slow enemies to a standstill, it doesn't affect projectile flight speed, meaning it's possible to get hit. Gloom doesn't affect Eximus units, so the extra safety is much appreciated in crowded areas. Now we can cover the builds for Sevagoth Shadow. There are 2 variants, one for combat usage and one for revives only. The combat build is used when Sevagoth does not use a Helminth ability. The revive only build is used when a Helminth ability is used over the Exalted Shadow ability on Sevagoth. We will start with the main usage build. Since Shadow does most of his damage with his claws, we're going to use Steel Charge as the aura. The Exilus mod is taken up by Prime Sure-Footed to avoid getting knocked down. Archon Continuity can be used if you want to mod Shadow's claws with toxin damage, since any toxin procs they apply will also proc corrosive. This is useful for Condition Overload and Corpus units. Otherwise, you can use Prime Continuity instead. Prime Flow and Equilibrium help out with energy generation and help keep KPM high through Embrace casts and Death Harvest spam. Stretch increases ability range. Transient Fortitude increases the Death Harvest debuff. Vigilante Vigor and Fast Deflection cause shields to recharge after a delay of 0.2 seconds and at a rate of 42.1 shield points per second. Combined with a shield cap of 37, shield gating becomes an afterthought. Keep in mind that Augur mods do not affect Shadow, hence the reason why we can't use them on the build for shield gating purposes. There is an alternative to this build which swaps Equilibrium and Prime Sure-Footed for Rolling Guard and Preparation. The stats for this build remain the same, but it plays much differently. Preparation at max rank will restore Shadow's energy to full every time it is respawned, meaning you don't need to rely on drops or Equilibrium to spam abilities. You only need to cast Reunite and Exalted Shadow again to get back to spamming abilities. Rolling Guard grants Shadow extra safety and gives you the ability to face tank Exodus attacks without having to reset back to Sevagoth all the time. This next build is only for revives and is not used in normal combat. This is the build you should use if you subsume over Exalted Shadow. The aura doesn't matter much since we're just using it for the extra mod capacity. Prime Sure-Footed keeps Shadow immune to knockdowns and allows you to get the revive off without pesky staggers. Cunning Drift increases the range of consume and also increases slide distance. Fortitude, Vigilante Vigor, and Fast Deflection all increase shield recharge rate up to 59 shield points per second after a 0.2 second delay. Rapid Resilience reduces the status duration on Shadow by 75%, making it much easier to tank gas, heat, and electric procs. Adaptation allows us to tank slightly more damage. Catalyzing Shields gives us a 1.33 second shield gate and works in tandem with the shield regen triad. Finally, we have Rolling Guard for the 3 seconds of invulnerability when stuff hits the fan. Time to cover the Shadow's Claws. The stance is unchangeable due to the Shadow's Claws being an exalted weapon. In the Exilus slot, we're using Dreamer's Wrath to access Tenkai and heavy attack critical damage. Primed Reach increases the claw's range, which is extremely useful since they have a 100% follow-through stat, so damage doesn't decrease when hitting multiple targets. Condition Overload increases damage against enemies with status effects. If you don't have a primer or just don't want to use one, use Prime Pressure Point instead. Sacrificial Steel increases crit chance, and Organ Shatter increases crit damage. Berserker Fury increases attack speed on kill, but if you just want it right off the bat, use Prime Fury instead. Killing Blow increases the damage of heavy attacks and heavy attack wind-up speed. Finally, Gladiator Fury increases crit damage. Keep in mind the set bonus doesn't apply to the claws, which is a bit unfortunate. The last mod is flexible. If you want to squeeze out more slash damage, use a Smite mod. This is the basic option, but annoying to many since you need to swap it based on the faction that you will be fighting. If you want a universal mod that you can slot in and forget about, go for Melee Elementalist, which increases status damage by 90%. It also increases heavy attack wind-up speed, but it is redundant due to the presence of Killing Blow. The last option is Spring-Loaded Blade, which increases the range of claws by 1 meter upon applying a status effect. This buff can stack up to 2 times for a bonus of 2 meters, bringing the total range of the claws to a respectable 6.5 meters. This is nice to have if you just want to hack and slash and aren't really concerned about damage. With that out of the way, we can cover the great Helminth options Sevagoth has at its disposal. If you want to use Shadow, subsume over Gloom. If you don't want to use Shadow and only want to use it for the self-revive, subsume over it. The best options overall are just Roar and Silence. Roar is great for making the nuke loop even easier. If you want to use this ability, you need to subsume it over his 4, which will completely lock Shadow out of use in regular combat, only being able to fight when the self-revive passive is active. Roar is one of the few abilities that can increase the current health damage from the Reap and Sow combo, which is extremely good in level cap content. With Roar, we need exactly 255% ability strength to one-shot enemies without viral status. Without Roar, one-shotting will be inconsistent at best. While it's true that you can one-shot enemies at 200% ability strength with at least 1 viral proc, weapon restrictions may not make it reliable. Also, you can't nuke a whole map like that, so it makes more sense to give yourself Roar for the extra ability and weapon damage potential. Silence can be used to buff Shadow, so you can subsume it over 3 if you want to use it that way. Otherwise, you can subsume it over 4. If you subsume it over 3 and use the Savage Silence augment, Shadow can benefit from the 700% stealth melee multiplier for massively increased damage. However, if you don't like using Shadow, you won't need the augment. The 2-second stun from this ability gets prolonged to 40 seconds while Gloom is active, making survival incredibly easy. Silence also blocks some Exodus abilities, Acolyte abilities, and enemy abilities. For the Arcane section, I'm going to break it up into 2 parts, one for Sevagoth Prime and one for his Exalted Shadow. For Sevagoth, the best Arcane options are Arcane Energize, Arcane Ice Storm, Molt Augmented, and Molt Vigor. I don't like recommending Arcane Energize due to it being non-essential on most builds, but for Sevagoth, I need to make it an exception. With Gloom making it impossible to have energy regen over time, it's hard to maintain healthy energy levels. Since we are running a shield gate setup, we can't really justify running out of energy in high-level missions, hence the recommendation. If you subsume off Gloom, you may not need to use this Arcane, but you will need an alternative form of energy generation. Arcane Ice Storm is something that I can't stop recommending due to it being able to buff both ability duration and strength. Sevagoth doesn't have any abilities that can proc cold, but you know what can? Epitaph Prime. This weapon on its own is insanely powerful and makes a great primer and procs cold innately. Plus it has a 20% headshot bonus with Sevagoth, so it just makes sense. I will be making use of this if I can mitigate energy issues down the line. Molt Augmented is a near mandatory Arcane. Having this on the build allows us to outsource ability strength and lets us hit the 200% cap needed to one-shot enemies with the Reap and Sow combo. Besides that, bonus ability strength adds to the crit chance steroid from Shadow Haze, meaning we can scale our weapons easily. Keep in mind that the crit bonus is applied in the same way as Arcane Avenger, meaning it has a great value on a low crit chance but high crit damage weapon. Finally, we have Molt Vigor. Like Molt Augmented, this arcane increases ability strength. Upon casting an operator ability, the next Warframe ability cast is granted an additional 45% ability strength. This does not require kills and is very simple to upkeep. I would use this arcane if you don't want to run Molt Augmented, but it would not be something to bring in Endurance. At the moment, I run 2 combos, Energize and Molt Augmented or Ice Storm and Molt Augmented. The extra ability strength allows Sevagoth to nuke effectively and increases the potency of any buffs you Helminth onto him. Again, I highly suggest tailoring this build to your needs as Archon shards can cover any deficiencies you have. Okay, now for Shadow. The best arcanes I can suggest are Arcane Aegis, Barrier, Energize, and Fury. Arcane Aegis assists in Shadow's overall survivability by providing a shield regen buff on hit. Because the Shadow build also focuses on shield gate survivability, this can be a lifesaver. This is especially true while performing a self-revival. The innate shield regeneration is affected by fast deflection and vigilante vigor, making the Shadow harder to kill, which then makes self-revival easier. Next we have Arcane Barrier. This arcane, like Arcane Aegis, assists in shield regen and fully regenerates shields on proc. This is a nice arcane to have if you have some copies lying around, but it's not mandatory. Energize is here for the same reason that it's on Sevagoth. Energy maintenance can be somewhat difficult on Shadow since ranged kills are impossible. I would only use this arcane if you are not using the preparation variant of the Shadow build. Finally, we have Arcane Fury, which is purely meant to buff the Shadow Claw's damage. The claws already hit like a truck, so any extra damage will cause them to scale extremely well. Because we can't prime enemies effectively with Shadow out, we will have to buff damage another way. If you are planning to use Shadow in combat, I would suggest using Arcane Fury and Aegis together. This will increase his melee damage and survivability. If you are subsuming off Sevagoth's ability to use Shadow and are only using it to survive, I suggest using Arcane Aegis and Barrier together. The only focus school I would use is Madurai. Sevagoth, at least now, is an amazing nuke frame and benefits from ability strength and casting speed, which Madurai grants. Power Transfer grants the casting speed that Sevagoth needs to pull off his Reap and Sow combo efficiently. After switching from the operator, begin the ability loop to nuke the rooms. Sling Strength activates after 2 consecutive Void Slings and grants an extra 40% ability strength. If you are trying to outsource ability strength, this buff is perfect. Plus, this works with any Helminth buff like Nourish and Roar. Void Strike and Void Fuel are only used in level cap Void Cascade or Eidolon hunts. While they are nice, they do not affect Sevagoth's base kit or any Helminth abilities. However, you might want to mess around with Epitaph Prime to get some funny damage numbers. As for Archon shards, this is really simple. I run 1 Tauforge Amber shard for casting speed and 4 Tauforge Crimson shards for ability strength. This grants us a 60% buff towards our ability strength, making it much easier to hit the cap needed to one-shot enemies with or without Roar or Viral. The only stat that Sevagoth cares about for nuking is his ability strength. If you don't have enough, then the Reap and Sow combo won't work all too well. If you want to use Shadow, you can consider using Violet shards for extra melee critical damage. However, as it stands, Shadow is extremely clunky. The claws, while they do great damage, are slow and just aren't the best. It also doesn't help that Shadow's abilities, especially Embrace and Consume, aren't that great for the highest level of content. If you are trying to run it in base deal path, it's perfectly fine, but in Endurance, you will want to use a Helminth setup. You also want to remember that the damage from Shadow's claws are affected by Sevagoth's ability strength, so Crimson shards are still useful. Alright, now we just have to cover weapons for the caked up Helmsman. To be honest, Sevagoth with any of the featured builds makes weapons hit a lot harder, so take my recommendations with a grain of salt. These just stood out in testing. Primaries are all over the place, but I recently tried the Kuvich Hacker, Tenet Archoplasmor, and of course Tenet Glaxion. The Kuvich Hacker is already strong and bleeds enemies out like nothing else, but the crit buff from Sevagoth takes it to another level. Combined with Gloom, headshots are incredibly easy to hit. Tenet Archoplasmor obliterates everything in a very wide area, basically giving the middle finger to any adds in a cardinal direction. The crit buff is very welcome. Tenet Glaxion is solid for damage and has the added benefit of granting energy via Photon Overcharge. For secondaries, we have Sevagoth's Signature, Epitaph Prime, and Kuva Nucor. The Epitaph Prime receives a 20% headshot damage bonus when used by Sevagoth, further enhancing its incredible damage. The Kuva Nucor, although notorious for its low crit chance, has a base critical multiplier of 5 times. With the crit chance buff from Death's Harvest, you can take full advantage of the multiplier easily. For melees, I just use any crit stick with good range. Glaive Prime, Guandao Prime, and Cronin Prime are all great crit melees and can take full advantage of Death's Harvest buff. These are only 3 options out of many others, so please try out your favorite and see how it does. And that is it for Sevagoth Prime. First of all, I am so sorry that the video is long. I didn't want to miss anything, and I want my videos to be as comprehensive as possible. As for my thoughts, I'll keep them brief. Sevagoth Prime is amazing. He's incredibly fun and effective, and while he takes a lot of investment, I believe some players will believe it to be worth the trouble. That being said, I'm not the biggest fan of his Shadow since it feels clunky to use and the abilities, other than Death's Harvest, are lackluster. If DE decides to polish them up to feel a bit better and less restricting, I can see him becoming even more popular. Let me know what you guys think. If you have any suggestions or thoughts, please leave them in the comments. As always, thank you for watching and happy farming. Stay safe.